In the past, we've talked about hardware problems from the old days, but today we want to talk about 10 in-game problems that are now extinct. Problems that we face within and around video games themselves that just aren't a thing anymore. Because, for all the stuff we complain about now, some things in games have actually improved. So let's get started off with number 10. Bland faces is definitely a thing of the past. Remember when games were first becoming 3D, you'd walk up to a character and look at them and yeesh, like what happened? There's not really anything there. Sometimes there's like a nice, like cheap plastic version of a face slapped on the character model, almost like those like removable tattoos you would get out of the cereal box as a kid. That would be their face texture and that would be it. Not a lot of moving, not a lot of talking. Perfect example, first thing that comes to mind, of course, you know me, Solid Snake from the original Metal Gear Solid. Of course, it was the late 90s, but his head was just kind of like a big old polygon. Thankfully, when a game is really good, like Metal Gear Solid, you have great voice acting and writing that really can help sell the character without the need for a lot of facial expressions. Still, there were so many games of that time period where the faces were just like, ugh. I mean, even up to later games like Oblivion, we had tons of varied NPCs, and yes, technically they were detailed and they could move their mouths and everything, but they looked whack. It took a really long time for faces to not look bland, and thankfully those really plain, flat, blurry faces are just a thing of the past. Now over at number 9, not being able to save, or just a lack of auto-save in general. Now, of course, I don't want to discount some gamers love playing the old-fashioned way, whether you're just saving when you can, limited saves, like if you're playing a new Resident Evil but with the harder difficulty to play the old ways with the old save systems, or maybe you're trying to do a no-save run, or you're save scumming, whatever freedom you have. All of those choices were not available to you back in the day. Even before memory cards. Remember, correctly writing down those long annoying codes for save game states and then keeping them on a piece of paper that you would scribble them down on and hope you don't lose it, or else you basically lose your progress in the game. That was a weird half-step time, and I'm glad we don't have that anymore. I'm also glad that we're not at the point now where we have to leave a game console on for hours and hours because we can't save. Thankfully, the save department has gotten much better, especially cloud saves. You say what you want about the cloud and whether it's good or bad, but I think cloud saves, most of the time, are a very good thing. But really, bottom line, if we're talking about the games themselves, shout out to games for all mostly implementing autosave these days. Next at number 8, we're definitely glad that movement in general is much better. Gone are the days where your character can only walk or only run. Now, thanks to modern improvements like pressure-sensitive buttons, pressure-sensitive triggers, and good joysticks, obviously, of course, it's you don't think about it now, but you can have direct control over how much movement you put into a game. Sure, in the old days, it wasn't that bad. If something like Tomb Raider, if you wanted Lara Croft to carefully walk across a ledge, you would simply hold a button down or hold a key down, and then instead of running forward, she would walk forward. But still, sometimes it's the little things. Now, we just nudge a joystick forward a little bit, and that character will walk. Everybody plays differently on PC, there's a variety of different solutions, but just that added sensitivity, more context to your movement and how much you input to the game, I think that's a major win for us as players. Now at number 7, you know what's basically extinct? Having to keep real notes for games. Do you remember when games were physical and they would have real actual instruction manuals in them, and in the back of those instruction manuals there'd be multiple pages with blank lines that were specifically for notes? Yes, you would actually use those from time to time, because some games were pretty deep and there wasn't a lot of resources at the time. So that's really what you would have to do, and a lot of times it's actually within the game. I'm not talking about other stuff. We'll get to that in another point. I'm talking about the in-game mechanics. In certain old games, you'd find, a piece of paper that tells you the code to unlock a door. You'd have to remember that code and walk up to the door and enter it in. Now, almost every game in 2020 automatically throws up that code for you that you found before and is like, hey, here you go, I got it for you, or I'll just enter it for you automatically. No, back in the day, you'd have to remember that code, or you'd have to walk all the way back and find it again and write it down on a physical piece of paper. Yes, we do like that things are a little bit easier now, quality of life improvements, but that was kind of fun, so we're kind of contradicting ourselves here a little bit, but you can still do it for games, and sometimes it's kind of cool. The Witness was complicated enough that you'd want to write some patterns down and stuff like that. But still, yeah, more than anything, something that's extinct is just the video game manuals. I really miss those, especially when they were in full color. I digress. Over at number 6, one thing that we're glad is no longer an issue is communication problems on PC. This is the days before Discord and Skype, and then there was TeamSpeak, which was okay, but even the days before that, the early days of online play and communication was a little bit rough, at least in terms of if you wanted to actually speak to someone with your voice. I think some people forget, you don't realize just how far we've come. I mean, on the console side, of course, I think Xbox Live Chat, PlayStation, the way they've easily integrated that with you and a friends list and popping in and out of chats and groups, no problem, is fantastic. But on the PC side, stuff like Discord and a million other things, they're all totally seamless and great, and there's basically a program for every type of gamer that is playing with other people. And honestly, thank God for that. Now over at number 5, you know what's extinct, and we're glad? The online pass. Do you remember that? It wasn't too long ago, but it was kind of like a blip on the radar of gaming history. In the middle to late period of the PS3, Xbox 360 generation, it was certainly growing pains, but thankfully we've gotten over them. So some game publishers really had a problem with stores that would take video game trade-ins. You'd buy a game, you'd play it, when you were done with it, you would bring it to the store, get some store credit, spend it on a new game, and walk out. Then someone else would come along and pick up that game for cheaper, buying the used copy. Certain publishers out there for a very brief period of time would include a little card in the game case that was a code that acted as an online pass, giving you access to the online mode and features of said game, the multiplayer mode or whatever. Now, say people who would pick up this game a couple months down the line on the used game shelf wouldn't have this online pass and wouldn't have access to the online features of the game, and they would have to get an online pass. You guessed it, usually by buying one. This was not a good thing, man. All of the YouTubers like us, all the websites were pretty much totally against it. Players were obviously against it too, and we didn't see much of it for too long. Now it's not even a thing. I think some people actually even totally forgot about the online pass. That's extinct, and we're glad. There's still bad things happening in games today from a consumer rights standpoint, but thankfully at least one of them died off very quickly. Over at number 4, to piggyback off of what we were talking about earlier in terms of taking notes in games, what about getting stuck in a game and the game had no in-game hint system or any type of help system at all? Now a lot of games are designed with accessibility in mind, not only just for players that are just having a hard time, but more for players that are maybe younger or have a disability. Back in the day, there was nothing if you were stuck and you'd have to buy a guide, like an actual physical book, or you'd go to the library, or you'd look it up and you'd print it out on a printer. Or if you go further back, there were actually tip hotlines for certain games. Now things are so seamless because we're talking about in-game and in software. It's as simple as switching out of your game and firing up the YouTube app on your console, or if you're on PC, just opening up a window, popping up a tab, and Googling it. Now there's so much video game information out there, every single game is explored down to the tiniest, deepest depths, that's just straight up not a thing anymore. But down to number 3, something that's extinct is not having anything to actually play on your console. Gone are the days where you'd play through a game and you'd finish it, and that's it. You'd have nothing. I think, number 1, generally, more video games now have some great replayability to it, more added features, more new ways to play, bigger games in general that just warrant a replay. That's one part of it, but the other part is the modern infrastructure and just how games and game publishers and game developers work today. There's essentially always something out there for free. Granted, I am talking about players that can have their console or PC hooked up to a stable internet connection at least, but if you're savvy and you do your research, or if you just pay attention to what's going on, chances are you can swoop in and grab a free game at some point, and you're just basically always gonna have something to download and play. Maybe it's smaller, but still, there's always something. Back in the day, you just have 3 cartridges and that's it. That was your games. Maybe they were short games. Maybe there was nothing you could do and you just play them over and over again until you went insane until next Christmas when you got another game. But now, thanks to the internet, things are pretty different. It doesn't work that way anymore, at least. But coming down to number 2, something that is extinct, and I am very happy to see it no longer exist, and that is distance fog. Essentially, game worlds that were too big for their hardware were actually obscured by fog. A perfect example is the original Silent Hill. Of course, the fog was an absolutely incredibly effective horror technique, really building atmosphere and the fear of the unknown, but that fog also kind of existed because you were in an open town area, and the game couldn't handle displaying too far down the street to you. Another example is the original Spider-Man game on PlayStation 1. There was a plot reason why the city was covered with fog, but essentially the game couldn't render the entire city down to the city streets below, so you'd only get the rooftops, and then a couple of feet past the rooftops, it was just all fog. It worked back then, but looking back now, yeesh, that stuff has not really aged well. I'd actually say Silent Hill is one of the only places it aged well because it makes sense. Maybe that and some RTSs. Thankfully, game technology has improved, and we've seen stuff where even if a game can't really load in things far away, you'll at least get a blurry representation of it, not just outright fog, which is crazy. Otherwise, bad draw distance and distance fog is pretty much no longer a thing, and I think with the next generation, it's going to be gone entirely. And you know what? Thank God. Now, down to number one, something that is pretty much extinct now, at least when it makes sense, is static cameras. Gone are the days of cameras that you couldn't move, the original Spyro the Dragon, or maybe Tomb Raider. Could you imagine playing a game like that, Tomb Raider, today, where the camera just follows you directly behind and you can't move it around without at least stopping and pressing a button and fiddling things around? I'm glad cameras have gotten much, much better. I do sometimes like fixed camera angle games. I do kind of miss some of them as a big Resident Evil fan, but just generally like third-person static cameras that you had little to no control over, I'm glad those aren't around anymore. I also do want to take the time to point out, because I always do, throw shade at modern video game camera controls, because still, I think for the last 10, 15 years, how many video game reviews do you read or watch that are like, yeah, the gameplay's really good, but the camera is a mess? We still haven't totally figured it out. And I think that's a really good example for just how gaming is, and how in another 5, 10 years, we're probably going to be talking about more in-game problems in games that just don't exist anymore. But I don't know, it's just a fun little trip down memory lane. We'd love to hear from you guys in the comments what issues you have with some older games, some stuff that's just not around, and also some stuff in video games today that you wish die off and eventually we can make a video and we talk about them being extinct. I bet you guys can think of a lot of them. I'm looking at you, microtransactions and loot boxes and blah, 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 blah. Let's talk anything down in the comments. If you guys had fun with us, clicking the like button is the best way you can help us out. It legit shows us support. We really appreciate it. And maybe if you're new, consider subscribing, because we put out videos every single day. But as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you guys next time.